To understand the treble, the greatest achievement by an English club, first we must understand Manchester United. But before Manchester United, before Old Trafford, and even before the red shirts or even the green and gold halves of Newton Heath, there stood Free Trade Hall and the Corn Exchange, as the Irwell snaked through the city, nicknamed Cottonopolis. Manchester, the first of Britain's industrial cities that burgeoned in the 19th century, had one more trick up its sleeve. (1878) and the dining room committee of the Carriage and Wagon Works, a railway department in northwest England, set up a football team. Too good for the interdepartmental competition, they were shifted into the Lancashire Leagues and named after the suburb of North Manchester, where they were formed, Newton Heath. From North Road to Bank Lane, the latter 19th century was a struggle for the new Football League team. Relegation to the second division in a playoff with Liverpool placed Newton Heath on the brink of insolvency. John Henry Davies saved the club and prompted a colour change to red and a name switch. Manchester Central and Manchester Celtic were both rejected as ideas, one so as not to be confused with the then main railway station in the city, and the other because of a more successful football team up north. Therefore, Manchester United were born in the shadow of the city's bigger club, City, who had been present at attempts to revive Newton Heath financially. Ernest Magnall was the man tasked with bringing Manchester United into the 20th century. Promotion in 1906 was followed by 2 league titles, both ahead of Aston Villa, with the club's first FA trophy sandwiched in between in 1909 over Bristol City. Also sandwiched in between was breaking ground, Old Trafford to be precise, in a 4-3 loss in United's new home to Liverpool on February the 19th, 1910. It was a home supposed to be fit for the next big team in English football, with promises of 100,000 person attendance. That didn't come to pass in troubling times, again financially. On the other side of the First World War, Jack Robson and John Chapman were both hired as managers, mainly for their frugal approach to spending, as United stagnated throughout the 1920s. One shining beacon of hope arrived at the club in 1931, the textiles magnate James Gibson. At the time of his arrival as chairman, Manchester United seemed destined for the 3rd division. His very first board meeting shaped the rest of the club's history. He desired an academy team to feed the senior and reserve teams. The youth policy was established, as in 1937, the Manchester United Junior Athletic Club was inaugurated to aid youth development. Their yo-yo in between 1st and 2nd divisions ceased with the onset of another global war. December 1944, club official Louis Roca wrote to Matt Busby, imploring the former Liverpool and Manchester City player to consider his first job in football management to be at Old Trafford. Despite a verbal agreement with Liverpool, Busby accepted, on the conditions that he was given 5 years and full autonomy. He surrounded himself with like-minded individuals to form the strong bond of family. Jimmy Murphy, his right-hand man whom Busby met in Bari during the war. But while he assisted Murphy in shaping the players of tomorrow, while scout Joe Armstrong would acquire those players, the quartet by 1948 would build the first great Manchester United team. 4 silver medals in his first 5 seasons in the league was supplemented with another FA Cup, won against a Blackpool team in 1948 that contained great Stan Mortensen and Stanley Matthews. By 1953, Busby had won United's 2nd league title with a team that was partway through its demolition. The stars of 1948 in Johnny Carey, John Aston Sr., Jack Rowley, Charlie Mitten and Stan Pearson would be phased out, whilst only Johnny Berry and Roger Byrne were retained into the European era. Manchester United had spread their net as far and as wide as the times would allow to create the Busby Babes, the second great Manchester United team. With the inauguration of the FA Youth Cup, the United stranglehold on the competition accentuated Busby's desire for youth. What was once a successful team now added beautiful football to their arsenal. Busby, a man who became known as the first tracksuit manager, was wedded, as many of his time were, to the WM system. However, Don Revie remarked upon watching a United reserve team that they were more fluid and reminded him of the superb Hungarian team that dismantled England in 1953. Busby could move with the times too, following the back four trend popularised by the World Cup winning teams of Brazil. Ray Wood kept goal, although he would be replaced by Harry Gregg in late 1957. Roger Byrne and Bill Foulkes were the pillars in defence, whilst who we would term as midfielders now were Jackie Blanchflower, Mark Jones, Eddie Coleman and Duncan Edwards. Labelling the latter, Coleman and Edwards, as merely midfielders, or as they would in the 1950s, wing-backs or half-backs, would be a complete disservice to their incredible ability. Up front, a plethora of talent included David Pegg, Dennis Viollet, Billy Whelan and Bobby Charlton from the youth system, whilst Tommy Taylor was signed from Barnsley for £30,000. They were insatiable. They were on course for 3 league titles in a row and teamed it with superlative football both domestically and abroad. They were the first English club to play in the European Cup, going against the Football League's wishes, but a route aided by FA Chief Stanley Rouse that Matt Busby took. After a late dash back from a 1958 last 16 tie in Prague, United only narrowly arrived back at Old Trafford in time to draw 3-3 with Birmingham City in the league. This prompted the Football League head Alan Hardacre to impose a strict rule that demanded any team travelling back from Europe must be back in the country 24 hours prior to a domestic arrangement. United had only faced elimination from the European Cup the prior year when paired with the experience of a domineering Real Madrid in the semi-final. A 3-3 draw in Belgrade over Red Star confirmed a potential final with Los Blancos should United overcome Milan. Chartering a flight from Belgrade, Matt Busby, his players, staff and several journalists landed in Munich for refuelling. At a shade past 3 p.m. local time, at the third attempt to take off from the Munich Raum Airport, BEA Flight 609 was unable to gain enough speed on a slush-soaked runway and crashed. Matt Busby lost coaches Tom Curry and Bert Wiley, as well as players Roger Byrne, Jeff Bent, David Pegg, Eddie Coleman, Billy Whelan, Tommy Taylor and Duncan Edwards. Johnny Berry and Jackie Blanchflower's respective careers were over, and 23 people in total lost their lives. Matt Busby narrowly escaped the same fate, his last rites read on 2 separate occasions. As the remaining stars of the brightest football team in England convalesced, the snow in Munich thawed. Had they stayed in Munich overnight, disaster would have been averted. Manchester United, as ever, were emboldened by Busby's spirit, the city imbued in a football sense like never before. The manager would make a public appearance in a losing cup final effort to Bolton Wanderers before returning to reignite the Phoenix from its ashes. Busby suffered with enormous bouts of guilt, only spurred on to continue the job at times by his wife Jean, and only 5 years later, with a new team, were United successful again. The travails in the league didn't suggest so. Busby created Manchester United's third great footballing team. Narrowly avoiding relegation, United won their first piece of silverware since Munich with an FA Cup final win over Leicester City in 1963, a trophy which Bill Foulkes declared the single most important trophy in the history of our club. In the team that day at Wembley, as well as survivors Foulkes and Bobby Charlton, were Tony Dunn, Shea Brennan and Paddy Crerand. All 5 would be on the same turf 5 years later for the European Cup final. Dennis Law, a major proponent of both teams, would sadly miss the 1968 final through injury, and it was he, alongside Charlton and youth recruit George Best, that completed the trinity. Never had a collection of players shone so brightly together at the club before. All three would win the Ballon d'Or between 1964 and 1968. They are all now immortalised opposite the great man whom they served, Sir Matt Busby, outside Old Trafford to this day. Best, a man perhaps befitting that surname alongside Nobby Stiles, John Aston Jr. and David Sadler helped return United to Youth Cup glory in 1964. Alongside goalkeeper Alex Stepney and the latest name off the academy bandwagon, Brian Kidd, they made the 11 that defeated Benfica for the club's first European Cup. It was a catharsis for many, the realisation of a dream for Sir Matt after so many brutal knockdowns, the latest of which saw United pick themselves off the canvas in the latest semi-final defeat in 1966, a harrowing return to Belgrade against Partizan. Of the 1968 triumph, Bobby Charlton stated, "There was an understanding that something was over, something that had dominated our lives for so long. 8 of the final team were academy products and half of those were from Manchester. The dream not only of Busby but of former chairman Gibson was truly realised." There was a feeling of job done. That's what it felt like to George Best, barely 22, when Europe was conquered. Busby left his post the following year, promoting 31-year-old Wilf McGuinness from within, whilst remaining general manager. The club would oscillate from the introverted Frank O'Farrell to the extroverted Tommy Docherty and back again, from Dave Sexton to Ron Atkinson. Cups were won, the odd starstruck night under the European lights attained, but Manchester United never threatened to return to the heights of Busby. Enter Alex Ferguson. The former striker from Govan helped displace the old firm up north and gifted Aberdeen their only European glory, with the Cup Winners' Cup against Real Madrid in 1983. This success, alongside his determination and high standards, made him an ideal candidate at Old Trafford. Within weeks in Manchester, he trebled the scouting system, with more than an eye on the youth policy enacted by Gibson and Busby of yesteryear. With the project needing time and bearing no fruit, a 2-1 defeat at home to Crystal Palace in December 1989 became immortalised with a banner that was headed to Ra Fergie. Mark Robins' FA Cup third round match winner at the City Ground against Nottingham Forest helped propel the bottom half United into the final. Its importance in terms of Ferguson's long-term job prospects in Manchester appear to be an urban myth, however. The noose loosened somewhat around the Scots' neck after Crystal Palace were dispatched at Wembley though. Glory in the Cup Winners' Cup over Barcelona in Rotterdam came, and the League Cup followed the year after that. The cornerstones of Manchester United's fourth great footballing team built. Peter Schmeichel kept goal behind Paul Parker, Gary Pallister, Steve Bruce and Dennis Irwin. A mixture of Ryan Giggs, Lee Sharp and Andrei Kanchelskis rang the wings, whilst Brian Robson and Paul Ince were the ubiquitous forces centrally behind Mark Hughes and the final piece of the puzzle, Eric Cantona. Guided by Sir Matt Busby's pipe smoke in the Manchester United offices and his long chats with the pillar of the institution he now managed, Ferguson was able to give Busby his final wish. Ferguson's first 3 pieces of silver earned him respite. The league title earned him the belief of the supporters. Sir Matt Busby would pass away 7 months after the Premier League triumph of 1993. Springboarded by a first title in 26 years, Cantona et al. Went one better, the double of 94. The Frenchman deployed from the number 10 position, which was ultimately a cheat code in the rigid days of the English 4-4-2. There still lay bumps in the road though. The continual failings in Istanbul, Helsinki and Barcelona in the revamped Champions League, and the concession of the Premier League to Blackburn Rovers after Eric Cantona kicked his way into a 9-month ban. Compounding that sour mood was Ferguson's fire sale of 1995. Gone were stalwarts Mark Hughes, Paul Ince and Andrei Kanchelskis. Paul Parker, Steve Bruce and Lee Sharp would depart 12 months later. Alex Ferguson was creating Manchester United's 5th great footballing team. His fledglings included the 1992 Youth Cup winners, David Beckham, Ryan Giggs, Nicky Butt, Paul Scholes and the Neville brothers. Alongside Andy Cole, Roy Keane, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and Teddy Sheringham, that great team inched nearer and nearer the holy grail of the Champions League. Choose Cool Britannia, choose Oasis or Blur, choose Optimism, choose a film's opening monologue to rip off as your own. This was the 90s. It was Spice Girls, it was Chris Evans, it was New Labour, it was Damien Hirst, it was Britpop, it was Trainspotting. First and foremost, it was Manchester United. The most public face of Manchester United, David Beckham. 26 million viewers in Britain had seen him dismissed in the World Cup against Argentina. 3 days prior, a hero for his goal against Colombia. Now he was demonised and ostracised as the customary English scapegoat. 10 heroic lions, 1 stupid boy spat one headline, accompanying an effigy, and for the majority of the season, trouble at every single away match. It was an unnecessary worry in a pre-season full of them. Arsenal had dominated the prior season, claiming the double that had been United's in 1996. Teddy Sheringham had failed to replace Eric Cantona. Andy Cole was still uneasy as well. Injuries hampered the club, from Ryan Giggs' hamstring niggles to Roy Keane's 10-month layoff. To fill the hole, big money was committed. 10.6 million on Dutch defender Jaap Stam, with Jesper Blomqvist added for 4 million. Still, this was nowhere near the European elite of Barcelona, Juventus and Inter Milan, or even Newcastle United for that matter. They couldn't persuade Patrick Kluivert towards a club either. Despite the reluctance of the board and assistant Brian Kidd's preference for Wimbledon's John Hartson, £12.6 million was finally pledged to Aston Villa for Dwight York. The transfer proved to be the beginning of the end of a decade of partnership between Ferguson and Kidd. Perhaps Kidd already had his head swayed anyway, with rumours of Everton and Manchester City's interest in him as a manager. Even Alex Ferguson caught flack from the board, ignited by the unease at forking out so much money on Dwight York, as well as a concern that the manager wasn't focused. Conversely, Ferguson felt criminally undervalued as only the 4th highest paid Premier League manager, despite 4 league titles in 6 seasons. United were committed to a fast start, most notably Jaap Stam, who agreed with his wife that she ought to be induced early that summer, so her pregnancy would not interrupt pre-season. It was a setup as traditional as the haunt they found themselves for the opener, Wembley in the Charity Shield under the shadows of the Twin Towers against Arsenal. Of the system, Gary Neville said, "None of us would pretend we reinvented the game or outwitted opponents tactically. Mostly it was 4-4-2 or 4-4-1-1, but played at an incredibly high tempo with real quality. 4-4-2 built on partnerships. Most famously, the overlap of Gary Neville and David Beckham on the right, with an alternative underlapping on the left from Ryan Giggs and 8 out of 10 Dennis, as Ferguson nicknamed Dennis Irwin. Roy Keane was back into the fold, reaffirming the telepathic understanding that he held with Paul Scholes. Squad rotation would become important. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and Teddy Sheringham soon relegated to the bench, whilst Phil Neville and Jesper Blomqvist were utility options and Nicky Butt would become pivotal. United failed to name an unchanged team throughout the season in the Premier League, with no player fielded for more than 34 league fixtures. The first game of the season, unfortunately, was a disaster, on the wrong end of a 3-0 hiding by league and cup holders Arsenal. Roy Keane set himself about the field like a caged animal unleashed, a sign of things to come in his recovery from the ligament injury that he suffered the prior September. United had been beaten plenty of times in the Premier League era. Aston Villa and Everton held scalps over them in domestic cup finals, and Blackburn won the league, most famously in 1995. However, after another 3-0 rout at Highbury in the Premier League, never before had Alex Ferguson come into opposition against such a force. It didn't help that Arsene Wenger had gotten under Ferguson's skin, so much so that he privately nicknamed him Old Vinegar Face and had plenty of public barbs to throw the Frenchman's way. One example reads, "They say he's an intelligent man, speaks 5 languages. I've got a 15-year-old boy from Ivory Coast who speaks 5 languages." United started the league season off slowly, David Beckham saving a point at home to Leicester City with a last-ditch free kick, whilst they couldn't find a way through West Ham at Upton Park, thanks largely to a blatant Neil Ruddock handball that wasn't given as a penalty. Beckham had survived the vitriol of East London, a place he used to call home, and kicked on. He would be the club's leading assist maker all season. In second place, new recruit Dwight York, who had a phenomenal home debut, bagging a double in a 4-1 win over Charlton Athletic. It was the first of quite a few instances of United salvaging a win from a losing situation. York scored once more against Coventry in a win at home before finally on October the 3rd at the Dell, a glorious combination was struck up. Andy Cole and Dwight York had teamed up once and it came in the stalemate at Upton Park in August. Given another run out nearly 2 months on, numbers 9 and 19 simply clicked. They netted 2 of the 3 in a simple victory on the South Coast and together grabbed 9 in the next 5 games. In that period, United helped themselves to 21 goals. Whilst their defence did leak at times, the front line was just getting going. Nowhere more pronounced was this than in the Champions League. Alex Ferguson had become obsessed with prevailing in Europe, to the point where he'd use run-of-the-mill Premier League fixtures to prepare for European nights. He'd do so by placing an extra man in midfield or defence. His mission statement: to outplay a European team away from home. Teams like Juventus, Ajax and Barcelona were the yardstick, all recent European champions. Juventus in particular had become a thorn in the side of Ferguson, despite a momentous 3-2 win over the Italians in the group phase the prior season, in which Ronnie Johnson started in midfield. Ferguson freely admitted that Europe had become a personal crusade. This season's personal crusade started in Poland, in Łódź to be precise, in a 2-0 aggregate win in the qualifiers. Having got his man in Dwight York, Ferguson felt he needed a platform to up his game. If ever there was a platform to challenge the former Aston Villa forward, then Group D of the 1998-99 Champions League was it. Bayern Munich, Barcelona and Brøndby were the opponents, and only one team was guaranteed to qualify. First up at Old Trafford were Barcelona, and Dwight York almost introduced himself to the Champions League in spectacular fashion with a first half overhead kick. Unfortunately, the goalkeeper was equal to it. Fortunately though, Paul Scholes helped himself to United's second of the game on the rebound. Ferguson labelled it the perfect football match, as David Beckham looked to have earned all 3 points with a trademark free kick, only for Barcelona's 2 second-half penalties to tie the game 3-3. Then to Munich, where Bayern awaited in the Olympia Stadion. The Germans were coming off a poor 2-1 defeat to Brøndby, courtesy of 2 late goals. They went ahead through an obviously offside Giovanni Elber, but crumbled once again. Dwight York nodding in his first Champions League goal, and Paul Scholes tapping in the second, with just a hint of handball. United would be on the wrong end of a late goal, however, as Peter Schmeichel came for a long throw and was simply nowhere near it. Teddy Sheringham was pressured into an own goal, and United were made to do with another point. Brøndby and 11 goals in 2 games set United straight, topping the group ahead of a trip to the Camp Nou. However, there appeared more pressing matters in the interim. A new goalkeeper would be needed for the following season after Peter Schmeichel announced the end of an 8-year career at the club that would conclude at the end of the season. Schmeichel cited a need to train and the fact that he was given scant time on holiday between the 1998 World Cup with Denmark and his return to Manchester for pre-season training. Stunned, but it ought not to have been a surprise following a number of uncharacteristic errors that saw the Great Dane fumble a free kick at Brøndby into his own net, and he also allowed a long-range Nicholas Alexanderson goal at Hillsborough through his large mitts too. The second league defeat of the season against Sheffield Wednesday, where United conceded 3 yet again, came at the wrong point. Barcelona were on the horizon again. Ferguson called them unrecognisable and unacceptable, openly pondering whether they were a big team anymore. However, he did note, they let themselves down really, because we know that come Wednesday against Barcelona, they'll probably excel. United led the group with 8 points by 1 from Bayern Munich and 4 ahead of Barcelona. Therefore, a win in Spain would all but see them through to the quarter-finals. In preparation, Andy Cole recalled a dressing down he received from the manager in training on the pitch itself. He was told to focus in no uncertain terms. Spotting an advertising hoarding around the perimeter for a Ford Focus, a light bulb moment sprouted in Cole's mind. If he was to score, he was determined to celebrate besides that advert. The early omens weren't great. Sonny Anderson got beyond the United defence and plundered a goal inside of a minute. The visitors didn't see much action in the first half and only had their first effort on goal midway through that half when Dwight York's snapshot from outside the area beat the goalkeeper. That's how the first 45 minutes would end. United only had parity thanks to Peter Schmeichel and his stupendous double save from Luis Figo, a catalogue of saves that he would make not only in this match, but throughout the season that proved so crucial. Early in the second, Cole had his moments of focus. By this point, everybody knew of the burgeoning strike partnership, barely 2 months old. Their most cutting moment came against Brøndby at Old Trafford. A lovely dummy from Cole, followed by York's layoff and an incredible dink from the former to find United's second goal on that particular evening. This time the pass came from the right into York, which allowed the ball to run. First time pass back into him from Cole, who received a similar ball back at breakneck speed. In the box, Cole took a touch with the outside of his right boot before coolly placing it into the bottom corner. The combination between Cole and York was out of this world, offered Clive Tildesley on ITV, one of the greater soundbites for the soundtrack to United's European campaign. For as much as this match is lauded, however, 3 points were not gained from the trip. Rivaldo was mesmeric as ever, curling in a free kick, arrowing in an overhead kick, and he almost won the contest at the death with a long-distance effort which rattled the bar. Still, another 3-3 against Barcelona, a match which Ferguson called a night of complete abandon. One match left at Old Trafford with fate in their own hands. It didn't matter that the result wasn't more positive. The fact that Manchester United had come up against the likes of Rivaldo, Luis Figo, Luis Enrique and gone toe-to-toe was enough. 4 years prior they had been obliterated by the Spaniards 4-0 and United crashed out. 5 survivors remained from that night. Like the win over Juventus a year prior, the Camp Nou of November 1998 was just another brick in the wall. Things appeared to be changing on the pitch at Old Trafford, with more European hurdles navigated. So too were things changing off the pitch. On September the 6th, 1998, after 2 months of talks held by B-Sky B and Martin Edwards, a change in ownership seemed almost inevitable. United's board had haggled upwards and eventually Rupert Murdoch settled at a price of 240 pence per share, which equated to a club valuation of £623 million. Sky spokesperson Mark Booth even led a press conference at Old Trafford, where the only question he couldn't answer was fielded from the Daily Mirror. Who is Manchester United's left-back, they asked. The prospective owners could not answer. Fan revolt soon gave way for the announcement from the Monopolies and Mergers Commission that ruled the prospective takeover unlawful. The club would remain in the hands of the Edwards family, unpopular enough, but at least they weren't the apparent, all-conquering evil media moguls. It would have been a profitable excursion for Murdoch & Co. too, seemingly. Deloitte ranked Manchester United as the richest football club in the world in early 1999, with an £88 million turnover that dwarfed even the giants of Real Madrid and Barcelona, as well as the more successful Italian sides, such as Juventus, AC Milan and Inter. It was a number more than Arsenal and Chelsea combined and made up 20% of the entirety of the Premier League. This off the back of sheer domination since the inception of the league in 1992. United made sure of their quarter-final fate in the Champions League amid confusion after a 1-1 draw against Bayern Munich at home as one of the best second-place teams. Aside from that, December was disastrous for the club. Aston Villa, Tottenham Hotspur and Chelsea held them to draws in the league. The latter liked it so much that they drew either side of Christmas with United. The most damning result, though, came with a quirk. Alex Ferguson wasn't present. Attending his sister-in-law's funeral, interim assistant manager Jim Ryan took charge of what was another 3 goals conceded at home to Middlesbrough. The blow was by no means cushioned by late goals from Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt. A loss was a loss. United couldn't afford many more in the league. What's more, Manchester United were eliminated from a competition in December, a 3-1 defeat at White Hart Lane after eliminating both Bury and Nottingham Forest, which sent out a potential quadruple down the drain, losing in the League Cup quarter-final. Whilst that wouldn't derail United's season, Brian Kidd's departure for Blackburn Rovers on December the 4th might have done. His successor wouldn't appear until February, and it maintained an animosity between Ferguson and his assistant for quite some time to follow. Kidd, who won the European Cup with United in 1968 as a player, was recruited as a youth coach in the late 1980s before his promotion in 1991 to succeed Archie Knox as assistant. In fourth place at the dawn of 1999, United's season was on the ropes. The corner was turned both off and on the pitch, 10 goals put beyond West Ham and Leicester in successive league games, whilst revenge was gained over Middlesbrough in the FA Cup third round. Whether or not a Christmas blowout that saw the club pick up a £30,000 bar tab helped the players' fitness levels, it certainly aided with morale. Perhaps a more pertinent reason for United turning their nose up on their season was the intense training camps Ferguson put on throughout January. He desired the players to slug it out through the month, the last not to feature the hustle and bustle of the Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday schedule. It was to be a mini pre-season where the players would be put through their paces, tired out in order to be fit for the business end of the season when the Champions League returned. Ferguson's plan worked. Gary Neville thought it a masterstroke. He's this Glaswegian union man dealing with a young bunch of millionaires, and he managed to ground us in every team talk. There was always a story to reinforce work ethic and principles. Peter Schmeichel was afforded his long overdue rest, jetting off to Barbados whilst the players turned up the heat in freezing conditions at the grounds such as Filbert Street and the Valley. He would miss the 6-2 thrashing United put together over Leicester City. Paul Scholes noted, "In 1999 we had a bit of everything. Every time you went on the pitch, you thought you'd score 3 out of 4. In the raw numbers, the more intense training regime appeared to help. United secured 1.72 points per game prior to the Middlesbrough defeat and 2.4 points per game afterwards. They wouldn't lose a game until October. 4 games into 1999 came perhaps Manchester United's most transformative fixture yet, the 4th round of the FA Cup against Liverpool. United's arch-nemesis hadn't beaten United in the FA Cup since 1921. 6 ties between the two in 78 years. They met in 2 finals, 1977 and 1996, 2 semi-finals in 79 and 85 that had ultimately differing results for United, as well as the 4th round victories of 1948 and 1960. The tide threatened to turn. Michael Owen was gifted the freedom of Old Trafford, heading in a second-minute opener. Robbie Fowler really ought to have had a second before the half was up, wisping a wicked curling effort wide of the mark. However, United came closest to finding the second goal. Roy Keane headed against the inside of the post and the ball was only just about retrieved from the line by former United midfielder Paul Ince. Regardless of the close match, Ferguson needed to change things. He told his players to attack with more width. They needed to coax midfielders Jamie Redknapp and Paul Ince out to the flanks before delivering crosses centrally. All the chances went one way, to the home side. Roy Keane had a shot that was deflected agonisingly wide when for all the world it looked to be creeping in the bottom left-hand corner beyond David James. Then he struck the woodwork again. Andy Gray in the Sky Sports gantry chuckled. "This is Liverpool's day," he remarked, and it seemed hard to disagree with the litany of chances that somehow failed to find the net. On another day, the match would have already been won. With 9 minutes remaining, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was summoned on from the bench in a rare bout of a defensive 3 that was deployed by Ferguson. Desperate times called for desperate measures. In September, United had disposed of Liverpool comfortably. The goal that set them on their way that night was a Dennis Irwin penalty. They found their breakthrough from a set-piece again in the Cup. Andy Gray queried whether Beckham would aim for goal in a seemingly unprofitable area of the pitch. Instead, golden balls drifted the ball onto the back post for Andy Cole, who expertly cushioned the ball with his head back across the 6-yard box. Of course, Dwight York bore down on goal, only needing a tap-in to snatch the equaliser, and he did so. York raged down the byline near the tunnel, thrusting his fist towards the crowd, yelping with emotion. The forward claims he has never been so emotional after a goal. He stated, "That really wasn't my style, but something got to me that day." An 88th minute equaliser, but the match wasn't over just yet. Liverpool scrambled as Paul Scholes penetrated their penalty area, slinked to the right-hand side to pull his trigger of a right boot. The midfielder labelled this match as the most exciting and ultimately most satisfying finish to any game I ever played in. Instead of winding up for a vicious finish, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's left boot was in the way. The Norwegian teed himself up with a typically delicate first touch before sending David James the wrong way. Liverpool were out of the cup, the replay was averted, and Manchester United were fifth round bound. 3 minutes away from being dumped out of the cup, from it being Liverpool's day to suddenly a momentous Manchester United victory. Gary Neville called it the big one, and Solskjaer claimed he preferred to win football matches this way. Interviewed, he said, "To beat Liverpool this way is better than beating them 5-0, I think. It's the best way to win a football game in the last minute." United were handed the only Football League opposition they would face in the FA Cup when an upwardly mobile Fulham of the third tier would travel to Old Trafford. It's safe to say in a 1-0 victory through Andy Cole that the match wasn't nearly as dramatic. Europe was about to rear its head once more. The latter stages of the FA Cup were navigated into and the title race was coming into focus, with Manchester United placed front and centre of all three. If a strict mid-season training regime was the foundation, Liverpool at home in the FA Cup fourth round was the springboard to push off for the remainder of the season. Alex Ferguson, in an interview for the end-of-season review on VHS, said, "From then on, you just felt you were never going to be beaten." A bitterly cold, dour Sunday afternoon on the final day of January 1999 might not feel like the arena for one of the more important matches in a historic Manchester United season. This time it was. A Charlton Athletic team that were hanging in the division in their first season, back in the big time for a decade, were hanging in this contest too, by the skin of their teeth. Then Dwight Yorke rose on the back post and nodded in against the inside of the woodwork. Peter Schmeichel remarked that the win was amongst the most important of the season. 4 days later, Yorke netted the only goal of the game in another 1-0 victory, this time against Derby County. This was form that echoed Eric Cantona's superlative run-in front of goal in 1996. 1-0 at home to Derby County on February the 3rd was also notable. Manchester United were finally on their way to a new assistant manager. Fitting then that the ex-Derby man Steve McLaren's last match for the Midlands club came in the Old Trafford dugout. Alex Ferguson handed McLaren an open book, imploring him to recreate what he had done at Derby County. The assistant manager has since been clear that Ferguson was desperate to be at the forefront of the game moving forward. McLaren was amongst the first laptop coaches and had convinced Derby manager Jim Smith about the need of Prozone, as well as data scientists from Liverpool John Moores University. Match preparation was onto a new level, and Ferguson wanted a slice. McLaren caught Ferguson's ear of the positives of Prozone immediately. He enlisted Ram Vaganam to convince David Gill that Prozone should be installed. At a price of £50,000, McLaren got his wish, but only if the club won a trophy. His first game also notable thanks to Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's 13-minute 4-goal haul in an 8-1 drubbing of Nottingham Forest. A crunch 1-1 draw at home to Arsenal felt like 2 points dropped following Dwight Yorke's missed penalty, but United got back on track with 4 wins on the spin against Coventry, Southampton, Newcastle and Everton in the league. The match against the former at Highfield Road also a landmark, for it was the only occasion in which the appointed strongest 11 of Schmeichel, Gary Neville, Stam, Johnson, Irwin, Beckham, Keane, Scholes, Giggs, Yorke and Cole were fielded in the league. In comparison to Ferguson's first great United team in 1994, their strongest team started 13 of 42 games. Rotation in 1999 was key. An FA Cup quarter-final replay against Chelsea was the last thing that United needed. Dwight Yorke's beautifully sculptured lob over Ed De Hoy that sealed a Final Four place confirmed a century of United goals for the season. Prior to the contest at Stamford Bridge, Ferguson was finally asked about the possibilities of a treble. He called it impossibly romantic and remarked it would need a miracle, but was keen to reaffirm the club's desire. Anyone in this position has got to go for it. To earn the treble, the Champions League had to be acquired. The return of the competition in March marked the visit of Inter Milan. After 22 points from an available 24 in the league, so far in 1999 the continental competition returned to a priority. Teddy Sheringham confessed that Fergie took 4 training sessions in my time, that's in 4 years. They were always before European games. Inter turned up with a 3-4-2-1 deployed. Roberto Baggio and Yori Djorkaeff in behind Ivan Zamorano, 3 stars who were at the forefront of the 1998 World Cup. Matching the Italians' narrowness, fullbacks Gary Neville and Dennis Irwin would tuck in. Meanwhile, width was provided by David Beckham, who terrorised an ageing Aaron Winter. The Englishman laid on both goals for Dwight Yorke in a 2-0 victory, earned thanks to Peter Schmeichel's miraculously spread-eagled save from Zamorano, Henningberg's equally vital goal-line clearance, and Diego Simeone's disallowed goal. Beckham had the game of his life against his World Cup adversary. Of his right-sided partner and best friend, Gary Neville praised Beckham, the energy and stamina of Steven Gerrard and the delivery and quality of Kevin De Bruyne. A day later, Beckham would become a father for the first time. Not a bad week at all. United pivoted again for the return leg at the hostile San Siro, Ronnie Johnson dropping in to central midfield. He deserves praise for keeping a relatively unfit Ronaldo quiet. The Brazilian's replacement, Nicola Ventola, pushed the quarter-final issue in the second leg, lapsing on a rare Roy Keane error to break the deadlock. Inter were comfortably the better team, but United would qualify due to Paul Scholes coming off the bench and, in his words, shinning the equaliser in. Due to the hostility in the stadium, Ferguson called this win the biggest step forward under his management. Where previously they had fallen in similar ties to Monaco and Borussia Dortmund, United returned to the semi-final of the Champions League. Sandwiched in between ties against the almighty Juventus was hardly a comfortable ride of it in the Cup. Arsenal at Villa Park. Arsenal earned a replay fortuitously thanks to Dwight Yorke's offside positioning in the build-up to Roy Keane's goal. In between Arsenal fixtures, with his equaliser against Juventus in mind, Alex Ferguson offered carrot and stick to Ryan Giggs. He told him that he was playing within himself and he was dropped for the replay, but reminded the Welshman that he had the ability to change any game. The replay would hold up as one of the greatest games ever played on English soil. Gary Neville stated that out there on the pitch, we just knew that this was something special. Arsenal hadn't conceded in 11 hours, United hadn't beaten them in 6 fixtures, but David Beckham's stunningly whipped finish deceived David Seaman, and it went some way into ending that latter statistic. Dennis Bergkamp equalised, and by the end of normal time, United were clinging on. Nicolas Anelka had a goal ruled out for offside as Roy Keane found himself sent off for a trip on Mark Overmars. Overmars changed the game, on for Freddie Ljungberg. Ryan Giggs, though, was on after the hour, and he would do the same. But first, the game, the season in fact, was almost lost. Ray Parlour ran at Phil Neville in stoppage time in the second half. The fullback tripped his opponent in the box. "I thought my United career was over. My life is over. Kill me now," Phil Neville remarked, retrospectively. Bergkamp went to Schmeichel's left. The Great Dane was equal to it. Consequently, Neville proclaims he owes the goalkeeper his life. For the Arsenal forward, Tony Adams said the penalty created a trauma and put the Dutchman off taking penalties. Into extra time the game went, and, to paraphrase the chant, Patrick Vieira gave Ryan Giggs the ball and Arsenal won nothing at all. 12 touches of the ball, 60 yards, bobbing and weaving throughout half of the opposition team. It was a wonderful run from Giggs, as announced down Martin Tyler's microphone. Interviewed for ITV, Ferguson was prophetic. "Our supporters will be talking about that for years. The players will be talking about that for years. That's what football is all about." And yet nothing was won. 7 days later, United were due in Turin. Ferguson described Juventus as the benchmark, a final mental hurdle after the group tussles with Barcelona. However, they had sacked Marcello Lippi and handed the keys to the palace to a young Carlo Ancelotti. United scraped a draw in the first leg, their midfield swamped by the likes of Deschamps, Davids and Zidane. The move of Beckham more centrally stemmed the tide in the second half, and with the energy of Gary Neville on the overlap, that industry was needed again at the Stadio delle Alpi. In front of the stadium's first sellout of the season, Jesper Blomqvist and Beckham were deployed narrow in order to match the diamond in Turin. This started well, but Pippo Inzaghi's double inside 11 minutes belied that. Midway through the first half, ITV commentator and former Manchester United manager Ron Atkinson muttered, "The next goal is the most massive of the season." And so it proved with the resulting corner. Roy Keane flicking it goalwards, 2-1 and 4-3 on aggregate. Game on. A captain's goal, as Clive Tilsley remarked. Keane was instrumental and wrote in his 2002 autobiography, "Anybody looking to throw in the towel now had the perfect opportunity. Anybody seeking to prove that they were worthy of playing for Manchester United also had the chance to prove it." 10 minutes later came heartache for the Irishman, fouling Zidane after a loose Jesper Blomqvist pass. A yellow card ruled out United's engine room for the final. 14 minutes from time, Paul Scholes would join him on the bench for that final, should they reach the Camp Nou, of course. A typically rash tackle on Deschamps that rightly earned a yellow. In a stadium where Paul Gascoigne was famously rendered to floods of tears under a similar scenario in 1990, Scholes and Keane were never going to allow that to happen. Of Keane's performance, Ferguson wrote, "I didn't think I could have a higher opinion of any footballer than I already had of the Irishman, but he rose even further in my estimation at the Stadio delle Alpi. It was the most emphatic display of selflessness I have ever seen on a football field." Years later, Michael Cox for The Athletic said Roy Keane was nowhere near as good in this match that he has been remembered for. However, it was Keane's constant demands and the highest of standards that formed the bedrock of this iteration of Manchester United. Zidane and David's, once rampant against United, were limited because of the captain. Dwight York hadn't scored in 7 games. His header from a right-sided cross inched United forward on away goals. At half-time, Ferguson boasted to his players that Juve were gone. Ancelotti pivoted to a 4-3-1-2 to control the midfield, and whilst Yapstam had to clear from the line and Inzaghi found the net for a third time, the latter chance was disallowed and Juve didn't look like scoring legally. Meanwhile, United struck the inside of the post twice through Dwight York and Dennis Irwin before finally finding the third goal that they craved. A long punt upfield was fumbled into the path of York, who danced through the defence and was fouled by goalkeeper Angelo Peruzzi. Such was their combination, Andy Cole was quick on the scene to tap in and remove the penalty doubt. 3-2, full speed ahead, Barcelona roared Tilsley down his ITV microphone. Another immortal sentence for the immortal soundtrack. In 1968, having trailed 2-0 and 3-1 away at the Bernabeu to Real Madrid, United came back late on to win the tie, thanks to David Sadler and Bill Foulkes. In 1999, they had reached the pinnacle game in European football for the first time in 31 years, having done so in similar fashion. Ferguson praised the performance. It was the best by any team under his management, according to the man himself. For United as a club, it was revolutionary. It was the first time they had won in Italy at the 9th attempt. Italy's dominance in Europe was over. 1999 was the first time in 8 years that wouldn't feature an Italian team in the European Cup final. 35 days later, Manchester United would line up in the Camp Nou against Bayern Munich. May 26, 1999, Manchester United's first European Cup final since the management of Sir Matt Busby. Also May 26, 1999, the day that would have been Busby's 90th birthday. %12%, that was the percentage of time that Manchester United held a lead of more than 1 goal after the January FA Cup victory over Liverpool. They spent an incredible amount of time living on the edge across 3 competitions that were all going down to the wire. Speaking of Liverpool, after flip-flopping between wins and draws against Wimbledon, Sheffield Wednesday, Leeds United and Aston Villa, the title race was due another twist when United travelled to Anfield on May the 5th, 1999. United, leading through Dwight York and a Dennis Irwin penalty, were pegged back, and it all started with what Ferguson called one of the least likeliest penalties even Anfield has seen. Of all players, it was Paul Ince that dragged Liverpool level in the dying embers. Added was the controversy of Dennis Irwin's red card for kicking the ball away, ensuring that he'd missed the FA Cup final. It had Andy Gray as incredulous on commentary as it had done Ferguson, who proclaimed that we will not let him deny us our title. There was so much consternation that even Martin Edwards went public with his unhappiness, stating, "If Arsenal or Chelsea win the Premiership by either 1 or 2 points, I trust they will strike a special commemorative medal for Mr. Ellery because he will have done it for them." Ellery received death threats following the controversial draw and subsequently pulled out of the final game of the season that was due to be important in the title race at Highbury between Arsenal and Aston Villa. On the final week of the season, the title race had one more turn in it. Arsenal hadn't lost in the league since December the 13th, United not since December the 19th, and yet both failed to win their penultimate fixture. Despite Ian Hart's missed penalty that crashed against the crossbar, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank sent a dagger into Arsenal hearts late on with a Leeds winner at Elland Road. United had 24 hours to stew on this result, knowing a win would all but win them the title. Standing in their way, a former employer of course, Brian Kidd and his Blackburn Rovers side. Blackburn needed a win, otherwise they were relegated 4 years after winning the league. 0-0 was the scoreline, giving United the slimmest of advantages come the final match day. Retrospectively, Ferguson admitted that United had an ability to make a crisis out of a drama. The final day was no different. Les Ferdinand opened the scoring at Old Trafford for Tottenham Hotspur with a lob, and in scenes not too dissimilar from the final day of the 1994-95 season, United couldn't buy a goal. Paul Scholes missed chance after chance. David Beckham headed over from point-blank range. But 2 minutes from the end of the half, a Beckham special, this time from open play, whipped into the top corner beyond the stranded Ian Walker. Of his celebration, Beckham noted that in wanting to win so badly, his celebration looked like fury. At half-time, Teddy Sheringham was substituted and left indignant. He would later remark on how, save for the final two fixtures, it was his worst professional season yet. In his place, Andy Cole, who had suffered through the aforementioned final day of the 1994-95 season. That day, United needed a win at Upton Park in the hope that Liverpool could do them a favour. They would, begrudgingly, yet Cole, just 5 months into his time at the club, missed a glut of chances that cost United the league. Fitting then that the destiny of the league title in '99 owed to the England international finding the net. He collected a quote-unquote hoof down the channel from Gary Neville, expertly bringing the ball under his control and instantly opting for a delicate lob. Redemption. The title equalled Alex Ferguson and Sir Matt Busby up at 5 titles apiece, and was the 17th time that United had recovered from a losing situation in the league that season. 1 down, 2 to go. An FA Cup lineup that made brief enemies out of both Nicky Butt, who knew deep down he couldn't be risked ahead of the Champions League final, and Jaap Stam, who hadn't completely recovered from an Achilles injury. Roy Keane played despite a midweek arrest after a boozy night, but he wouldn't make the 10th minute, going down injured. On in his place, Teddy Sheringham, and within 2 minutes it became clear that United wouldn't make a crisis out of the cup final with Newcastle United. Sheringham turned his season around in its penultimate game, feeding off Paul Scholes for the opener before providing the midfielder for the clinching second goal. The double had been won in 1994, 96 and now 99, yet the season wasn't even nearly over. The team travelled to Catalonia via Concorde, decked out in pristine grey Donatella Versace suits at the request, obviously, of one David Beckham. The story these days reads of the treble that Manchester United were on course to achieve. However, Bayern Munich very much still had the same type of immortality in the pipeline. They had things simpler, winning the league by 15 points, had led the table all season and comfortably had the DFB Pokal in their sights. Their final against Werder Bremen would be 17 days later. They did run into a roadblock in the semi-final against Dynamo Kiev, initially going 2 goals down twice in Ukraine before claiming the tie 4-3 on aggregate. However, they had played 12 fewer matches than United throughout the course of the season. They too had a chance at ending a European Cup drought, only 8 years shorter than United's own drought. Bayern also had the experience of winning at the Camp Nou, unlike United, having come from behind to seal a group stage victory over the Spaniards a mere 7 months prior. Alex Ferguson had plenty of dilemmas with his team sheet, most notably in midfield, where he would obviously be without Paul Scholes and Roy Keane. Nicky Butt therefore was the first name on the team sheet, whilst Jesper Blomqvist had been given Ferguson's word weeks out that he would start. Originally, the Swede was slated for the left, with Beckham to be deployed from the right as usual and Ryan Giggs used centrally. However, after Ferguson had rejigged his team following Roy Keane's injury in the FA Cup final, which saw Ole Gunnar Solskjaer move to the right of midfield and Beckham centrally, doubts grew in the manager's mind. Beckham relished playing in the thick of midfield and excelled against Newcastle. Ferguson determined that he had to play centrally. As such, Giggs played on the right. The stage was set. According to Clive Tilsley on commentary, It had been the most perfect day in Barcelona. But it would start imperfectly for United. Ronnie Johnson bundled Carsten Janker over early on in a dangerous position, and past an unsighted Peter Schmeichel, Mario Basler found the bottom corner and the opening goal. United were behind, and deserved to be so, trailing going into half-time not only by the scoreline but also in attacking threat and general quality. Borrowing a story from his former Aberdeen player Steve Archibald, who missed out on the European Cup with Barcelona in 1986, Ferguson was armed with his half-time team talk, perhaps the most important words he would utter as a football manager. You will be 6 feet away from the European Cup, but you won't be able to touch it. I want you to think about the fact that you will have been so close to it, and for many of you, it will be the closest you ever get. And you will hate that thought for the rest of your lives. So just make sure you don't lose. Don't you dare come back in here without giving your all. Manchester United didn't get the uplift immediately, however. Andy Cole and Dwight York, a strike partnership that had blossomed all season, was suddenly static. Jesper Blomqvist was too nervous, Beckham too deep to affect things greatly. Teddy Sheringham was introduced on the hour. Ferguson played a diamond with York at the tip, whilst Giggs and Beckham reverted to usual haunts down the left and right respectively. Instantly, chances were created and a freshness installed. Still though, Bayern came closest. Mehmet Scholl's chip rebounded off the post and into Schmeichel's arms, liberating the Dane in his final game for United. Carsten Janker later struck the crossbar with an overhead kick. With the game won, Lothar Matthäus was withdrawn. The celebratory t-shirts circulated on the German bench, and UEFA President Lennart Johansson brushed past Sir Bobby Charlton in the executive box with an apology for the scoreline. He was due to hand the trophy over to the winner. With Bayern ribbons attached, the story goes that Johansson made his way to pitch level as the board was held up for 3 minutes stoppage time. As he made his descent, Gary Neville had earned United a corner. Clive Tilsley underscored it brilliantly with, "Can Manchester United score? They always score." David Beckham opted for a chipped corner as Peter Schmeichel had ventured forward, unsanctioned by his manager. In that split second, Beckham remembered the criticism flung his way by his goalkeeper in training should he misplace a cross. He nearly landed it perfectly onto his head. Instead, the ball was cleared to Ryan Giggs. The Welshman scuffed a shot goalwards towards Sheringham, who declared his chance a scuff off his sock. "Name on the trophy," proclaimed Clive Tilsley prematurely. Lennart Johansson had reached pitch side to the scenes of wild celebration and consigned himself to a retreat into the executive box. On the touchline, Steve McClaren suggested returning to the 4-4-2. Ferguson instantly declared that the match wasn't finished. As Johansson climbed back into the executive box, another corner was won. Beckham stood over it again. Schmeichel didn't come forward, Ron Atkinson sarcastically commentating that United were playing defensively, and consequently, Beckham delivered a more whipped corner onto the front post. Sheringham got there first and reasoned, "All I can do is head it into an area and hope somebody is there." In that area was the instinctive right boot, and Solskjaer won it. 102 seconds it took for the most dramatic comeback in football history. 102 seconds, and Lennart Johansson returned to his seat to more Manchester United jubilation. He'd missed both goals. He is supposed to have remarked, "What the hell has happened? The winners are crying and the losers are dancing." Suddenly, the first editions of British newspapers made zero sense, tinged with a bittersweet tone that praised the work of David Beckham and his colleagues, but lamented that United had come up short in Europe yet again. As journalists scrambled to correct their copy, Clive Tilsley was jubilant on ITV, proclaiming that Manchester United had reached the promised land, and it certainly felt so. Conversely, commentator for German broadcaster RTL, Marcel Reif, uttered immortal words too. "I know we are expected to analyse and explain what happened. I'm not able to, and I don't want to. Why not just be sad?" before switching his microphone off. They would go on to lose to Werder Bremen in the Pokal final 2 weeks later via penalties, winning only the Bundesliga. Sandy Busby, the son of Manchester United's first famous manager, succinctly theorised the entire football club in one sentence: "My dad was the foundation and Sir Alex the resurrection." Sir Matt from the Bells Hill coal fields, the newly anointed Sir Alex from the Govan shipyards, a football club initiated by the railworks in Lancashire, but created in Glasgow. In a flash interview with ITV's Gary Newburn, mere seconds after the realisation had dawned that Manchester United had not only won the Champions League, but the treble, Ferguson was tasked with summing up the game. He put it perfectly.
I can't believe it. Football, bloody hell. But they never give in, and that's to win it.
Peter Schmeichel, Gary Neville, Dennis Irwin, Ronnie Johnson, Jaap Stam, Jesper Blomqvist, Ryan Giggs, David Beckham, Nicky Butt, Andy Cole, Dwight York. The starting 11 for the 1999 Champions League final would never be replicated. Peter Schmeichel's telegraphed exit from Old Trafford was sealed with a move to Sporting before a Premier League return with both Aston Villa and Manchester City. Jesper Blomqvist's litany of injuries ensured he wouldn't play another minute for the club. Jaap Stam's comment in an autobiography led to his sale in 2001, a huge regret of the now knighted Sir Alex Ferguson, whilst two of his defensive colleagues made way in 2002, Dennis Irwin and Ronnie Johnson. Also departed by 2002 was a mercurial strike partnership of Andy Cole and Dwight York. Manchester United were unable to defend their trophy, bowing out to seven-time champions Real Madrid 3-2 on aggregate in the quarter-finals. It was a defeat that confirmed to Sir Alex the idea that the 4-4-2, at least in Europe, was dead and buried. Group struggles against the likes of Anderlecht and PSV Eindhoven the following season, as well as the subsequent appointment of Carlos Queiroz as assistant manager, rubber-stamped United's future as a counter-attacking team in Europe. Ferguson struggled to implement a three-man midfield with Juan Sebastian Veron, very much a round-shaped peg in a gap built for a square. Meanwhile, Ruud van Nistelrooy's protracted transfer from the Netherlands paid off with the Premier League title of 2003. It would be the only title that the Dutchman would win, for 2002-03's domestic triumph stood alone in the middle of an archipelago that was Manchester United's lack of successes in the 21st century. A second treble followed the treble, when Sir Alex Ferguson became the first manager to win three top-tier English titles on the spin, brushing aside all competitors in 2000 and 2001. Roy Keane's wishes after latter-stage European exits to Bayern Munich in 2001 and Bayer Leverkusen in 2002 were granted. The team had reached the end of its cycle. David Beckham was the first of the fabled class of '92 to depart, as he did so acrimoniously with the launching of a boot from Ferguson in 2003. Nicky Butt and Phil Neville, merely squad players by the middle of the 2000s, exited for Newcastle United and Everton, respectively. Mikhail Silvestre, who had impressed Ferguson as left wing-back for Inter Milan in the treble-winning season, was acquired, whilst the academy was harvested for Wes Brown and John O'Shea. Finally, the United defence was spearheaded by Rio Ferdinand in 2002. Only in the 2005-06 season did he receive a defence that deserved to stand up alongside him, with the shrewd acquisitions of Nemanja Vidic and Patrice Evra, as well as the well-overdue Peter Schmeichel replacement in Edwin van der Sar. The defence shored up, not that it helped much in Europe thanks to knockout stage eliminations at the hands of Real Madrid, Porto and Milan, before the ultimate indignity of a group stage exit in December 2005. This was a United in an identity crisis. Roy Keane exploded out of the club, Paul Scholes' vision problems left him out for long stretches, whilst Ryan Giggs found yoga and a new fitness regime too late to stave off the might of Arsene Wenger's Invincibles and the new special one on the block, Jose Mourinho and Chelsea. And that was only the story on the pitch. That year, the Glazer family ascended controversially to acquire the controlling stake in the club and thus plunged the club enormously into debt. On the pitch at least, with Sir Alex Ferguson at the helm thanks to his retirement U-turn in 2002, helped the footballing continuity with such a senior and ubiquitous figure. He adapted with the times. Queiroz returned from a failed stint in management for Real Madrid, and together with the youthful names of Cristiano Ronaldo, Wayne Rooney and Michael Carrick, they were ready to go again. In 2007, they blitzed Roma 7-1 to reach only a second Champions League semi-final since the treble-winning year, and after 4 years of strife, returned to the Premier League trophy. It was the first of another 3 titles in succession. Cristiano Ronaldo was the best player on the planet. Carlos Tevez was added to a front line that had become insatiable. Dangerously for their opponents, however, they had teamed that persistent attacking ability with a defensive astuteness like never before. Figures such as Darren Fletcher, Anderson, Owen Hargreaves and Ji-Sung Park would populate the team for the big occasions. Grafters, unsung heroes, to allow for the superstars to shine further afield. With a borrow of Luciano Spalletti's strikerless system deployed by Roma against United in subsequent Champions League seasons, Ferguson rewrote his team. Cristiano Ronaldo was the fulcrum, smashing in 42 goals in the 2007-8 season, a year where another treble seemed feasible. Unfortunately, a freakish FA Cup final at home to Portsmouth that saw Rio Ferdinand temporarily keep goal in a 1-0 defeat eliminated the Red Devils. The opponents on multiple fronts this time were Chelsea as opposed to Arsenal. The pair went tooth for nail to the final day of the Premier League season, goals from Cristiano Ronaldo and Ryan Giggs confirming Ferguson's 10th league title at the club. Weeks later, they were due for a Moscow date in the harsh Russian rain. Ronaldo, who else, scored before John Terry slipped and Nicolas Anelka faltered in the penalty shootout to bring home Manchester United a third European Cup. It could have been more, it really ought to have been more. And it only wasn't because of the greatest club team ever assembled. Manchester United were posted in Rome and London for their next two Champions League finals and were pitted against rookie manager Pep Guardiola and his Barcelona team. The midfield of Xavi, Iniesta and Busquets swamped United whilst Lionel Messi tore the baton from Cristiano Ronaldo's hands as the best player in the world at the time. His header in Rome's 2009 final ended Manchester United's dreams of a fourth Champions League. Ferguson's of tying Bob Paisley's then record of 3 European Cup titles as manager, and it ended Cristiano Ronaldo's career at Old Trafford. By the time the pair were reunited at Wembley 2 years later, the final was almost a foregone conclusion that Barcelona would be triumphant and United would return home empty-handed. Unthinkable for a Sir Alex Ferguson team. It came to pass, Pedro, David Villa and Lionel Messi scoring the goals that earned Barcelona and not United a fourth Champions League title. That season, Ferguson led United to another league title, their fourth in 5 years. Although unremarkable in of itself, it was notable because it was number 19. The greatest manager in the history of the sport had achieved what he set out to do, knock those Scousers from their perch. The Scot signed off with the club's 20th title in 2013, retiring in a blaze of glory with a 5-5 draw at the Hawthorns. Manchester United, though, didn't heed the warning from 1969, unfortunately. The dynasty of one great manager wasn't to be prolonged, as it couldn't after Sir Matt Busby retired. Compounding the loss of Ferguson was the departure of David Gill upstairs, and within 12 months, the quintet of Patrice Evra, Nemanja Vidic, Rio Ferdinand, Ryan Giggs and Paul Scholes. United were also in the hunt for a new manager after David Moyes was sacked with the club 7th, just 9 months into a 6-year contract. Where once the weight of the Glazer family's ownership failed to weigh the club down through the bumbling of David Gill's successor Ed Woodward in the transfer market and the distinct ideological changes year on year both in the transfer market and in the manager that occupied the hot seat, the strain of the Glazers could be felt. As Wilf McGuinness, Frank O'Farrell, Tommy Docherty, Dave Sexton and Ron Atkinson spun the carousel of very different characters, Old Trafford was sent into another spin by the managerial changes again in the late 2010s. The continuity of David Moyes was jettisoned for the tactical nous of Louis van Gaal before, after a first major trophy post-Ferguson in the 2016 FA Cup final, he was binned for the Machiavellian win-at-all-cost Jose Mourinho. The Portuguese manager won a treble of his own, but it could hardly be viewed as fondly as '99 when it contained the Community Shield, League Cup and Europa League. Mourinho's implosion was as accurately timetabled and predictable as ever, which left Woodward and the Glazers pivoted to the arena of the club legend becoming manager to garner fan support. After near misses in half a dozen competitions across 3 years, usually at the semi-final stage, the botched attempt of a European Super League and the pandemic storming of the Old Trafford pitch to force a fixture's cancellation, it's safe to say that fan support didn't work. Manchester United is a club built on the foundations of James Gibson, laid down on October the 30th, 1937, when the club fielded Tom Manley and Jack Wassall in an away fixture against Fulham. At least one academy player has featured in a Manchester United League squad in every single match since then. Sir Matt Busby reinforced this ideology and wouldn't let the decimation of the Munich air disaster ruin it. Much like Sir Alex Ferguson wouldn't let the memory of relegation in the 1970s and an inadequate scouting system destroy the club's lineage when he took charge in 1986. However, with each passing manager, the club stepped a little further away from the ideology that made Manchester United one of the biggest clubs in world football. Where once it was Busby's babes or Fergie's fledglings, it was now a haphazard tribute act of Real Madrid's Galacticos. Alexis Sanchez, Angel Di Maria, and the returns of Cristiano Ronaldo and Paul Pogba, the legacy of the rotten core that has run through the club in the past decade. Just as the clouds of yesterday dissipated, so they will again. The jigsaw puzzle of a chaotic transfer strategy has been realigned by current manager Erik ten Hag, who, unlike his predecessors, has maintained his authority amid shambolic interferences from above. Glimmers of hope have been apparent before, Jose Mourinho's bright starts, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's backing in the transfer market, to name a couple. As Manchester United progress through the 20s, it feels different this time. After the postponement of the European Super League and the collective act of chief executives backpedalling, Ed Woodward resigned. A restructuring took place, and alongside several elite English clubs, Manchester United is on the market. The ruinous regime of the Glazer family will soon be over. The 25th anniversary of the Treble looms large, right in time for the horizons of Manchester United to brighten up a little bit.